Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is the Britain-hating left-wing propagandist, Nish Kumar, famous for the MASH report, which was thankfully cancelled by the BBC recently and moved to that other channel, Dave. But Nish has also... I'm relieved to say, decided that enough is enough and has left that show himself and is on tour in 2022. Nish Kumar, welcome.
Good to see you, Krishnan.
Why do you hate Britain so much?
It's straight in, Krishnan. It's straight in. You didn't muck around, did you? You didn't at least... Normally, people at least circumnavigate that question before getting to it. But listen, you're a newsman. You don't have time to entertain the fripperies of the entertainment industry. You don't have time for small talk. Straight in. Why do you hate this country?
So look, I mean, the news about you is that you have just stopped late night MASH, or you decided to stop it.
Self-cancellation.
Yeah, self-cancellation. So why? Just explain that.
It's actually sort of a slightly more boring conversation than I think people are hoping for. I think people are hoping that I've gone mad or just decided to, flee the country or had an about turn in my political beliefs and I'm about to announce my new show on GB News. But I think it's a much more sort of mundane thing. I've been doing it for 5 years and there sort of comes a point where you want to, expand what you do. And yeah, there was sort of a variety of factors at work. I kind of wanted a bit more control of the show. It's a show that I was brought in to host and it's a show that I was very honoured to be involved with for 5 years. At this point, I want to have a bit more control and a bit more say in the work that I do on television. There was a level of discomfort about making me a producer on the show. It's not really something we do on British comedy shows.
Right.
And so I decided it'd probably be better for everybody if I just went my own way and tried to do something that I was maybe a bit more in control of.
That's quite surprising because to those of us who don't know anything about how comedy works, I suppose, and just the general public, you imagine that the star is
that's right,
massively in control of everything.
I think
the MASH report originally seemed to be modelled on an American show, like The Daily Show, we imagine that everybody runs around Nish and you're
that's right. Yeah. It's not quite the done thing in the same way here, especially with comedy shows. That I think with scripted comedy shows, there's maybe a little bit more of an emphasis on it that's happening now, but it's really not really the done thing. And also, I should emphasise the MASH Report was a show that was in development when I came on board. So it's a show that somebody else created and that a whole group of people were already working on when they brought me on as host when we did the pilot in 2017. So it is very much other people's work and it's their prerogative how they take the show. But I had a great time. I had a very pleasant half decade working on the show. There was a lot of noise and nonsense around it, but the actual process of working on the show and the people that I got to work with was very pleasurable. But, at a certain point, you want to... If you're going to be blamed for everything, you may as well have been in control of everything.
I mean, you have taken a huge amount of stick for it, and I think that's it's been very much a story of our time, hasn't it? Because I know you didn't come from nowhere, but you kind of came almost from nowhere in terms of sort of very, very high profile, very, very quickly.
It's certainly the most high profile thing I'd done. I was doing, I'd done stand-up on television on things like Live at the Apollo, and I had been on Have I Got News For You and Mock the Week. But certainly in terms of getting to host a show, it was a very sudden bump in my profile. For all of us, really, that was one of the exciting things about working on the show. It was a group of people. There was a point where, when we were making it, we were sort of like, when is an actual professional going to arrive? Because it was all people that I'd kind of come up with on the stand-up circuit. People like Rachel Parris, Jeff Norcott, the writers that I was working with, Tom Dean and Sarah Campbell. They're all friends of mine that I've known from the stand-up circuit. And I think it was a strange experience because we were all used to being on a show with more experienced people. And so you look across and you go, well, there's Dara. So he knows what he's doing. So we'll probably be fine. There's Ian Hislop and Paul Merton, but I was looking around and everybody was looking at me. It was like, it was like the responsibility version of the end of Reservoir Dogs, where everyone just ends up realizing they're pointing a gun at each other. And even the producers, it was like it was one of the first things that a lot of the producers had done. So it was a very exciting and wild thing to be involved in. And for all of us, it was a very sort of sudden bump in our profiles.
And social media was very important, I think, wasn't it, in terms of raising the profile and taking it way beyond the sort of the television audience of around 1 million.
Our viewing figures were, like you say, like in the ballpark of 1 million a week, but the actual reach of the show ended up being much wider because of social media. We
all use social media to promote what we're doing on TV and to spread the work wider. But you became a lightning rod. I mean, you sort of, you divided people almost immediately. Did that come as a surprise, or did you know that was going to happen?
I had a taste of it. I did an episode of Have I Got News for You in 2015, and I'd done bits on television before, but nothing as high profile as that. And also, the first time I did it, the host was Charlie Brooker, and the panelists were myself and Diane Abbott. And the fallout on social media for that was, I'd really never seen anything like that before. And I always think about the level of hostility I saw for Diane Abbott. It was absolutely extraordinary. It was absolutely incredible. The anger towards her really, and it was not more evolved than the fact that she is a black woman in politics. And the venom and vitriol that I saw offered to her after that episode was instructive on how things might be received. So I wasn't unprepared for it, I think it's fair to say.
But in terms of the comedy, I mean, you totally went for it, didn't you? You leaned into all the all the sort of the division, and it sort of fed who you were and what you were laughing about.
I wasn't interested in doing something without a point of view. And actually, to be honest, no one in the show was really interested in doing something that didn't have a point of view. And it didn't really feel like a time for, oh, they're all as bad as each other, aren't they? In 2017, it didn't really feel like a point where there didn't really seem to be any room or space to equivocate, really. In the summer that we launched the show in 2017, there were literally Nazis marching through America saying the Jews will not replace us in Charlottesville. And it doesn't really feel like in that sort of an atmosphere. And I mean, America was something that we didn't really go too far into because we felt like we're a British show and we wanted to engage with British issues. And we also then brought on Desiree Birch, who's a fantastic American comedian who lives in London, to cover that. But I use that more as an illustration of where the kind of cultural conversation had reached. If you've got Nazis running around, it doesn't really feel like a time to do political comedy that isn't taking a perspective on things.
I think you're right about the sort of they're all as bad as each other, and it goes beyond comedy, doesn't it? And I just wonder whether, did you feel BBC executives saying to you, you've got to do the other side as well. You've got to joke about the Labour Party. They've all got to be as bad as each other.
There were definitely some tricky points in the cycle of the show because we definitely expressed a perspective, which is not to say that that's the perspective of the entire show, because Jeff Norcott would also be on having a go at the Labour Party and defending his position as a Leave voter. So it wasn't exclusively one-way traffic. They started with the show by saying, we want this show to be edgy and dangerous. We want this show to cause trouble. And then when it started causing trouble, there was definitely a sense of, whoa, 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 whoa.
Yeah,
we didn't mean this trouble. We definitely did not mean this trouble. I mean, this is too much trouble. Can you rein in the trouble?
I mean, if you had a point of view, do you think you ever misused it? Did it ever just become too political?
What I can't do is go on there and say, Brexit's going terribly. This is absolutely terrible. Boris Johnson is, engaged in criminal activity. I can't just go on and say that, because the BBC lawyers would literally say you can't substantiate that unless you're saying something that's very, very obviously a joke and you can defend the kind of comedic intent of it, the lawyers will pull that stuff out. And, you know, everything starts for us with the work of actual journalists like yourself. So, you know, everything starts for us with going through the papers, reading the work of journalists, and then basically going, okay, and how do we tag a joke on this?
But what it sounds like is that you were also a bit frustrated with the news.
I think Boris Johnson receives favourable treatment in the hands of large sections of the British press. And that, I mean, I think if you look at the way that his handling of coronavirus was reported, I think he received a huge amount of favourable treatment. I felt it was very frustrating.
Do you mean on TV and radio, or do you just mean in the papers?
If we talk about political bias in the British cultural conversation, there's an allegation that somehow the entire media is tilted against the Conservative Party. But if you examine the Daily Telegraph, parts of the Times, the Daily Mail, the Express, the Sun, you realise that beyond the Guardian and the Mirror, there are not outlets that support the Labour Party, and there are outlets that have done sort of almost uncritical propaganda for Johnson's government that would have made Pravda blush. So that was definitely a source of frustration for me and for a lot of us working on the show, is that a comedy show was constantly being alleged of political bias when you buy newspapers that are basically apologists for for the Tory party. That was a source of constant frustration for us.
So do you think the BBC, with its impartiality obligations, or any public service broadcaster, because we all have it, basically the same impartiality obligations, is capable now of really doing a political, topical comedy show in an impartial way?
Listen, I don't know, with the pressure that's being exerted on the BBC, and frankly the pressure that's being exerted on Channel 4, I don't really understand how there is a need to please the government, because they're pointing a gun directly at the BBC and Channel 4. You know, the threats of Channel 4 privatisation, I mean, sure, it might well be a coincidence.
It's easier for the news in a way, because, you know, we all know what our job is and the viewers know what our job is. With comedy, it is harder, isn't it, to say comedy should be even-handed? Because, as you say, it doesn't appear to you as if everybody is as bad as each other.
A joke, by definition, I think, ends up taking a perspective. It's probably more to do with the comedy that I liked growing up, you know, and the stand-up of Chris Rock, the work of Chris Morris. I like other comedy other than comedy made by men called Chris, although based on that it doesn't seem so. But they weren't necessarily openly campaigning for a specific political party, but they had a distinct perspective. Whether it was Chris Morris's perspective on how the sensationalization of news reporting was affecting the way that information was being disseminated with the day-to-day and brass eye, or whether it was Chris Rock talking about race in America, that comedy came from you always had the sense of that comedy's perspective and point of view. And that was the stuff that I was really drawn to as a kid. And that was the stuff that made me really excited. It was comedy that was incredibly funny and seemed to have a strong moral perspective.
And it's comedy that is very hard to put on a regulated broadcast when it's being told it's got to be impartial.
It's very difficult. It's very, very difficult.
So, I mean, let's talk about growing up then. I mean, when did you get into comedy?
I can't remember a time before I loved The Simpsons. Because I started watching that show when I was about 4 or 5 years old. I was just obsessed with it. I loved Red Dwarf. That was a huge show when I was a kid. And when I was about sort of 13 or 14, I saw on Channel 4 Bigger and Blacker, which is Chris Rock's stand-up special from about 98. It was very mind-expanding. And then from when I was 16, my uncle and my cousin used to sneak me into comedy clubs that were like small comedy clubs that were in the back of pubs that definitely you had to be over 18 to go to. And I was visibly under 18. I looked like I was 12 until I was 26, at which point I looked like I was 40. So like I sort of missed my face, missed my 20s.
But are you like every other Indian kid in Britain who was brought up to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, or were your parents cool with comedy?
No, absolutely not. They were not cool with comedy at all. And I try not to talk about it because I hate to reinforce the stereotype, but I'm about to. My parents absolutely were convinced, like doctor, lawyer, or it's natural for an immigrant population, I think. The idea is that the first generation comes over and does whatever job they can take, and then the second generation does some job that means that the whole family can't be kicked out of the country. Yeah, the idea is that the first generation does the first job that's offered, and then the second generation does a job that plants you within the machinery of the infrastructure of the state so that you can't be easily removed. But unfortunately, like a lot of Asian kids my age, we were all exposed to goodness gracious me. And it was a contagion, Goodness gracious me incepted a lot of South Asian kids and planted the idea in their brain, like Leonardo DiCaprio hacked into our dreams and planted the idea in our heads that it was possible for us to be comedians.
It's very interesting, isn't it? The idea that you can be subversive as a second generation immigrant when you were supposed to be busy implanting yourself in the culture and making yourself useful and part of it.
And let's not pretend that some of the ways that I'm written about don't consider my opinion on Britain and Britishness invalid because I'm not white. This, it's absolutely unavoidable. I was a columnist described me as somebody who was biting the hand that fed him, which was a comment that I didn't really, I just thought it was somebody writing something mean about me. You kind of pass it by. And then a few months later, the same columnist wrote about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar, and wrote that they should have been more grateful to the country. And then suddenly, when you read that comment, it turns the biting the hand that feeds you. Comment. It puts a different complexion on it. Yeah, it puts a very, very different complexion on it. The thing that my parents really gave me was a sense of like, no, you are British, you were born here, you have the right to express your opinion as much as anybody else who was born here.
Would you ever think, maybe I should have not gone political? Maybe I should have done. I mean, there's a difference, I think, between you and Ramesh, isn't there, in terms of the kind of comedy you're doing and the kind of audience who are embracing you, and your opponents can turn around because so much of what you're doing is political and cultural and say it's nothing to do with race. It's just not funny. I don't think he's funny,
which is fine. And let me tell you, Krishnan,
but it's not true, is it? That's not why they don't like you. They don't like you because there's racism, but they can say it's because you're not funny.
You're right, but that was just. I was, even before the MASH, the two shows that I'd done in Edinburgh, and especially the show that I did in 2016, which was kind of in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote, because I started doing that show in August 2016 at Edinburgh Fringe. I'd already gone down that road. It's the reason that I was considered to I was in the running to host that show, was that I was already kind of down the road of doing political comedy. I'd been hosting Newsjack, which is a Radio 4 extra topical show, and so I'd been writing a topical monologue 12 weeks a year for the previous 2 years. I'm very interested in politics. I've always been very interested in the news, and I enjoyed comedy that took very serious and scary things and made them funny.
So how did you go about getting into comedy? And I mean, were your parents horrified?
I often say to them, like, what were you expecting? When I was a kid, I was like running around the house dressed up like Spider-Man. And you're like, even through my teenage years, all I did was talk to them about comedy. And the other thing I would say about them is that they were very encouraging and very sort of supportive about my interest in the arts. But yeah, they were pretty confused by it, I would say. But I started when I was at university. I joined a university sketch group, and then I went to Edinburgh in 2006. And within a month, I did my first stand-up gig. And from that, really, August to October in 2006, After that, I was like, it's my whole life has changed.
And in terms of what the kick is, I mean, obviously there's a kick in people just laughing and you being you being appreciated. But are you also getting a kick from them laughing at what you're saying and the subversiveness of that?
The thing that comes first is the laugh, really, is the excitement and the adrenaline rush of that. And then if you can find some way to connect with the audience, that's the thing that I think takes it to the next level. If you feel that you've revealed something of yourself on stage, or you've all sort of shared in a moment of catharsis because you all feel the same way about the political direction of the country, that's the thing that makes it extra special. You get the laugh and then you get the feeling of connecting with a group of people.
All comics have obviously failed at different times or bombed at different times. I mean, there's a video of you, obviously, that is very famous in that your failure was sort of spread on social media. When you look back at that, what do you think and how do you feel about it?
For context, it was a Christmas charity gig, and I told some jokes about Brexit and the Conservative Party that the assembled audience did not particularly enjoy. And when I look back on that, I think, well, I sort of feel like people have the right to boo. I don't have a philosophical problem. I don't think you should throw things, but I don't have a problem with the philosophy of I say something and you boo. That's, to me, is like they paid their money, I think it's infantile, and also it doesn't speak particularly well of them that it was at a charity gig. But I sort of feel like, you paid your money, do what you want. I really don't mind that sort of thing. The problem comes when people, when someone films it and actually then immediately sends it to the Daily Telegraph, and the Daily Telegraph uploads it, and it free of the context of the room. There's an honesty to something that happens between a performer and an audience. Whether that is positive or negative, there is still an honesty there. But when an extract of it gets spliced out and distributed, that's when things get dicey. The 24 hours after that, the thing that happened on the night was fine. And I went to the pub with my friends because they were all at the same gig. And Tim Key is a friend of mine, said, I bought you a pint to apologise for throwing the bread roll. And we all had a great laugh. About it. But then the 24 hours after that was a nightmare because, it was newspaper articles. Also, journalists if you do a talk show on for something, and they have to have your number to call you in. They keep your number on file, and then they start calling you from blocked and unknown numbers. And when that's coming in while you're actively receiving death threats, it really, really unsettles you. I don't have a philosophical problem with what happened in the room. The 24 hours afterwards was subpar, I would say.
And that was the sort of the media pylon where I guess racism becomes a factor, why people hate you, why people are piling in.
I don't actually have the numbers. I have actually done a tally of this. There's about 10,000 words written about that gig across various media outlets in the 24 hours after it happened. Why? We were a week out from an era-defining general election, and you're talking about a comedian having bread thrown at him. It's like, but what that does is it sort of stokes the flame. So there's this interesting thing where we have a tendency to sometimes talk about social media, but in a sense that sometimes lets the old media off the hook, because ultimately this thing only got distributed because the Telegraph put it online, and there is a kind of when you fall foul of the political right in this country, you sort of start to understand that there's a kind of symbiotic relationship between the old media and the new media, and one kind of feeds each other. So that the Telegraph is able to say this happened, then a bunch of people start tweeting about it, then another newspaper writes about the reaction.
Can I just ask you about gender as well, though? I mean, well, it seems to me that the sort of the sexism of comedy, particularly in TV now, is just so obvious and exposed that it's not even worth debating anymore.
I think the way that I always measured it when I started out was how unusual it would be, and this is not to say it doesn't happen, but how unusual it would be for somebody just to come up to me after a gig and say, oh, I thought you were funny, and I don't normally find Asians funny. However, for my female contemporaries, it was just a huge part of coming through.
TV is normally quite a leader in terms of saying we're going to address a particular issue when we're going to stack the cards a particular way on screen. They very deliberately don't seem to have done that with comedy. So the panel shows are still male dominated.
The wheel is slowly turning, you know, because particularly from my generation of comics onwards, you can't ignore the women of my generation, you know, because they were just the best comics. You know, what are you going to do? Not put Catherine Ryan on TV? You're not going to put Aisling Bea or Sarah Pascoe on television. You know, they were just undeniable. You know, to a certain extent, from my generation down, there's sort of this sense of like, your sexism is really doing you a disservice. Now, that's not to say that it's not still prevalent, because it absolutely is. Edinburgh, the Fringe Festival, is a very interesting thermometer by which you can read the temperature of where British comedy is. Because when you go to Edinburgh, I mean, we sort of take over like cod Stalinists and plaster our faces all over the city of Edinburgh. And what's interesting about that is you can see the makeup of where comedy is in terms of the posters. And when I first started going, it was pretty much all white dudes. It was pretty much all white dudes and Reginald D. Hunter. Like, that was pretty much it. And now when you look at it and you look at the new generation that are coming through, you know, people like Rosie Jones, Maisie Adam, Kemah Bob, these are all, you know, exciting performers that are kind of forcing their way into a broken system by sheer virtue of their skill and hard work. The only way things are going to change is if the decision makers start to become more representative of the country. That's the only way. At the moment, particularly in regards to gender in comedy, the talent and hard work of a huge number of very brilliant female comedians is forcing a change. But until there's more women involved in making decisions, I mean, somehow women have got bunched in with the minorities, even though they are, to be fair to them, most people. But if you're a woman, a member of the LGBTQ community, if you're a person of colour, we're only going to see real change when the decision makers become more representative of the country at large. And that's true of everything. That's true of sexuality, race, gender, and social class as well.
And so, having done sort of TV for a few years, how do you see your future? Do you want to actually be more like your hero Chris Rock and sort of essentially do stand-up that then gets picked up by Netflix and whoever else?
I'm very good at sort of just fixating on the thing that's coming up. So like when The Mash was happening, it was kind of all I could think about. And then that finished and I made that decision. And now all I can think about is this tour. So it'll be February to May next year. And it's kind of really all I can think about. I can't really think about more than one thing at a time.
And is the tour very much you as we know you? I mean, is it political?
It's a political show, and it's also about really what we've talked about a little bit, which is the sort of the experience of what the 24 hours after the bread roll thing, what that showed me about where we are as a country. You know, if there's one thing you have to say about me, it's that I can take everything personally. Whether it's an isolated comment on the internet or broad political movements, I'll somehow find a way to make it all about me. But yeah, that's definitely what the show is about. I feel very fortunate to have sort of made it this far in this career. And I think, you know, I always think about what happens if I have to go back to my office temp job. And, you know, if I have to go back to my office temp job now, you're like, well, I had a good run.
Because that's how you finance the beginning, isn't it? Just temping for quite a long time.
Certainly 5 years full-time office temp jobs. And then I worked part-time for a year. And then in September 2013, since then, all I've done is comedy.
You joked about sort of making everything personal, but I mean, I'm sure in a way it is, and it must be very hard to deal with in those sort of private moments. I presume you got a therapist.
I do, because it's something that like my partner, who is, you know, more enlightened on these issues had sort of been pushing me to do for a while. And then it only really... I sort of got bullied by her and my friend Brett Goldstein into doing it. I refused to engage with it. The real penny drop moment was when I was recording an advert for the charity Mind about how men needed to talk about their mental health. And I was like, it might be a good idea to start taking some of your own advice, my friend here. And so that was when I started about 6 or 8 months ago. And it has been very helpful for me. And it's probably something I should have done earlier. You know, I'm always wary about saying to people, you need to get therapy, because I'm also aware that it's a financial privilege. Because what we should be saying instead of you need to get therapy is we need to make mental health care free to everyone. And we need to improve access for everybody to mental health care and you know, help in that regard. I came through in a very supportive group of comedians. One of the first things that happened after the bread roll was Ramesh called me and was like, should we have lunch tomorrow? Just to make sure that I was okay. Make sure that I was okay. And I have also lent very heavily on my contemporaries, and I'm very appreciative of them.
How do you square, though, that, you know, the way people have treated you with the way you satirise other people? So, you know, if Piers Morgan was here, he'd say, well, look at that cartoon he did of me and Donald Trump. Which
I personally drew by hand, of course.
Yeah. In what way is that sort of just light-hearted or caring or whatever it might be?
That was a sort of very specific joke about his interview with Trump. I've come face to face with him before, and he's very good at criticising other people. He's maybe not great at taking criticism himself. He's one of the most thin-skinned people in the British public space, you know. So when he kind of slags me off, I sort of am like, yeah, okay. Yes, you're right. That's, you know, I've said stuff about him. He said stuff about me. I don't really have a problem with it.
But he ended up in a sort of a tag team with Andrew Neil, didn't he?
The Andrew Neil day was a weird day. Andrew Neil just was firing off some tweets about the MASH report a couple of years ago. I don't know what was going on in Andrew's life at that time. He might have been going through a difficult period.
Does part of you ever wonder whether that was a sort of a closing in of the establishment, that maybe that had something to do with the BBC not renewing the show and the rumours about Tim Davie wanting to shut you down and all of that kind of thing?
To be honest with you, I suspect I'll never really know the full story. We were told in November of 2020 that they had run out of money, and if you work within the BBC, you know that that's a danger. The budget's constantly being squeezed. And, you know, we were all sort of the opinion that 4 series was more than we had anticipated at the start of the project.
So if you could change the world in any way, how would you change it?
I think if I could change the entire world, the first thing you would do is pump infinite financial resources into renewable energy and things to fight climate change. Because, I mean, there's so many problems in the world, but Armageddon feels like it should be number one on the concern agenda. I would put infinite financial resources at the disposal of the climate lobby, because they're fighting a battle against some people who are absolutely minted. And the battle that they're fighting is, do we all continue to be alive?
Nish Kumar, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Krishnan.
Our producers are Faye White and Rachel Evans, and you can watch all these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.